By the time the first hour of morning had passed, the air no longer felt cool. The sun climbed quickly in Egypt, a steady ascent that transformed soft dawn into sharp heat. For the slave, this was the true beginning of the day. Tools in hand, tasks laid out, overseers watching from shaded perches. The labor varied depending on where one was assigned. Some worked in the quarries, chipping limestone or hauling rough hewn blocks with ropes across wooden sledges. The dust clung to skin and eyes, leaving a gray film that burned with sweat. The work was less about skill than repetition. Strike, lift, pull, step, movements that wore grooves into both stone and body. Others spent their hours grinding grain. It seemed humble, almost gentle compared to the stone hauling, but it was endless. Bent over low querns, they pushed stone against stone, breaking kernels into meal until arms trembled and backs ached. The sound was constant, a slow scraping rhythm that filled the air like a chant without melody. Meals for entire household depended on it, and there was no pause until jars were full. Some labored in weaving sheds, surrounded by looms strung with linen threads. Fingers moved quickly, repeating patterns taught by those before them, weaving balls of cloth that would clothe the household or be offered in temple stores. Here, the air was less harsh, but the hours were no shorter. The eyes grew weary from staring at lines of thread, and small mistakes meant the work was unpicked and begun again. And still, others cleaned, sweeping courtyards, scrubbing floors, carrying water from jars to basins. Menial, yes, but exhausting in its own way. Brooms of bundled reeds wore down hands. Water jars left red grooves in shoulders. These tasks were quiet, invisible, often unrecorded, but they filled every hour, leaving a little space for thought beyond the next trip, the next sweep, the next command. Whatever the setting, the pattern was the same. Labor under watch. Overseers carried staffs, not always to strike, but always to signal authority. They stood in shade where possible, tallying output, noting names when effort seemed to falter. A worker might be spared for a few moments of rest, but only when allowed. Shade breaks came rarely, often just long enough to sip from a jar of water and wipe sweat from the brow. Then it was back again, to the quarry of dust, the grain, the looms. Survival in these hours depended on rhythm. Those who hurried burned out too soon. Those who dragged invited reprimand. The wisest learned to pace, steady steps when hauling stone, careful turns of the quern when grinding, a quiet hum to mark time while weaving. Small efficiencies mattered. A better grip on the rope, a smoother motion of the hand, a whispered song that stretches the mind beyond the moment. These were not luxuries, but skills, passed from one worker to another as lessons in endurance. The body adapted, but never fully. Sweat ran freely, and with it, salts lost to the skin. Bread alone could not replace them. A few chewed onions, or dates tucked away from rations, sharing among companions in quick, furtive gestures when overseers looked elsewhere. Such exchanges were not rebellion but survival, tiny economies of strength carried in handfuls of blood. There was also companionship, even in silence, a nod exchanged when ropes were pulled in unison, a shared rhythm at the quern stones, a murmur of encouragement when arms faltered. These small acknowledgments reminded each person that they were not entirely alone, even if their day belonged to others. The hours stretched long. The sun rose higher. The skin of the arms and face darkened, calloused, cracked. Muscles ached in familiar patterns, and yet the work did not stop. To endure was to remember that the day, however endless it seemed, did in fact have an ending. To make it there, one had to conserve, to repeat, to keep the mind tethered to the rhythm, not the pain. But labor was only half the weight. Equally heavy were the rules, the restrictions of movement, speech, and even rest. To understand the life of a slave in Egypt, we cannot look at work alone. We must see the invisible boundaries that shaped every choice, every gesture, every silence. That is where we turn next, to the rules and risks that govern survival. Labor under the sun was visible. Everyone could see the hauling of stone, the grinding of grain, the weaving of cloth, but less visible and just as heavy were the rules. To live as a slave in Egypt was to move inside an invisible boundaries, each one shaping what you could do, say, or even think of attempting. The first rule was place. You belonged where you were assigned. A quarry gang did not wander into a weaving house, nor did the household servant drift out to the fields. Movements were tracked by overseers, written in ledgers by scribes. To be in the wrong place was to invite suspicion. Why were you there? What were you seeking? What were you trying to escape? Even an innocent misstep could lead to reprimand, so most learned quickly to stay within their allotted paths. The second rule was speech. Words carried weight, and not all words were free to use. To speak out of turn in front of a master was dangerous. To argue with an overseer, even more so, and yet silence could also be costly. If a task was misunderstood, if an order left unclear, the burden fell on the worker, not the superior. So speech became careful, measured, often limited to what was necessary. The safest words were practical ones. Yes, here, finished. More than that, and risk grew. Possessions were limited. A worker might keep a reed mat, a jug, perhaps a small amulet or bead if luck allowed. Anything beyond that was often confiscated or questioned. Rations were distributed, not chosen. Bread, onions, beer if available. To keep some aside, to trade with another was done quietly, out of sight. These small exchanges, a piece of bread for a favor, a sip of beer for help with a task, formed quiet economies within the boundaries of control. They were not rebellion, but they were ways of softening the edges of restriction. Illness and exhaustion carried their own risks. The ledgers demanded bodies present at dawn, numbers tallied and complete. To falter was to slow the machine. Some overseers allowed rest, especially if the sick could be replaced by another in their household. Others recorded absences as failures, punishments later extracted in food or freedom of movement. For many, illness was endured in silence, hoping the body would recover without notice. And yet, within these strictures, people still found ways to bend the rules quietly. A handful of grain saved from rations, hidden and shared at night. A conversation carried out in whispers, laughter smothered until after dusk. A child allowed to nap a little longer, while an older sibling carried their share of water. These were not acts of defiance, but of humanity, gestures that reminded each person that they still had choices, however small, however fragile. The risk of stepping beyond these boundaries were real. Stories survive in fragments of punishment, beating recorded in ostraca, fines written into ledgers, workers reassigned after disobedience. But for most, the pressure of rules worked silently. They were internalized, learned early, reinforced daily. To survive was to know where the lines were and to walk them carefully. And yet, even inside this narrow corridor of rules, sparks were made. A song hummed while grinding grain, though no one had asked for it. A joke whispered at the loom, though silence was expected. A glance exchanged during roll call, though eyes were not meant to stay lowered. These sparks were risks too, but they were also survival, for the body could endure repetition, but the spirit needed these flickers of self to make the day bearable. And when the sun finally set, when tools were stacked and overseers' tallies complete, what then? The rules loosened slightly. In the evenings, there was time for stories, for gossip, for laughter, for the small comforts of cool water and starlight. To see the human side of this life, we must step into those hours after labor, when bonds were formed and dignity was quietly reclaimed.